Children, we finished learning the equilibrium level of income, employment and output using aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. And next we are going to learn the saving investment approach. The equilibrium level of income is determined at a point where saving is equal to investment. And we will be learning about the few other concepts such as full employment level, then underemployment and overfull employment. So these are the other concepts that we are going to learn along with saving investment approach. Now let us begin with the saving investment approach. Saving investment approach. According to saving investment approach, equilibrium level of income or output or employment is attained at a point where S is equal to I. That means saving equals investment. At a point where saving is equal to investment. And you learned how the saving investment approach is derived from the equations C plus I and C plus S. Now, this is a table showing saving investment approach. So, equilibrium level of income or output or employment will be determined at a point where saving is equal to investment. Now, let us see the table. In the table, level of income, consumption, saving, investment and remarks is given. Income level 0, you can find consumption as 40. The same values are used throughout the chapter, which is easy for you to learn. Then saving comes as minus 40 because you know if consumption is 40, that is autonomous consumption, saving will be definitely minus 40 because this saving. Then comes investment, I told you, which is fixed for a particular period of time. Now we can see at 0 level of income, saving is minus 40, isn't it? Then at 100 level of income, saving is minus 20. How did you get the saving? You know S is equal to Y minus C, isn't it? S is equal to Y minus C, isn't it? So 100 minus 120 will give you minus 20. Again saving. 200 minus 200 will give you 0. Then comes the next saving, that is Y is income, Y minus C, 300 minus 280 will give you 20. Then comes the next 400 minus 360 will give you 40. Then 500 minus 440 will give you 60 and 600 minus 520 gives you the value 80. So you got the values of savings. Now let us compare the saving and investment and see the remarks. Now in the first one you can find that saving is less than investment. It is minus 40 and plus 40. Okay, definitely, so saving is less than investment. Next one is minus 20 and 40. So again saving is less than investment. Then comes 0 and 40. Again saving is less than investment. Then comes 20 and 40. Both saving and investment. Again saving is less than investment. Then comes 40 and 40 where we can find saving is equal to investment. And that happens at the level of income 400. In the previous table also you can find the equilibrium level of income happened at 400 level of income where we found AD is equal to AS. So here similarly at 400 level of income saving is equal to investment. Both saving and investment are equal. Now let us see the next condition. 500 level of income, we can find 60 and 40 where saving is greater than investment. Saving is 60 and investment is only 40. Then comes at 600 level of income, saving is 80 and investment is 40. Saving is greater than investment. So we can find that equilibrium level of income has happened at a point where saving is equal to investment, and that is at equilibrium level of income 400. Okay. So this is with regard to the saving investment approach table. Now we have to depict this in the form of a diagram. This is a diagram where in the first part of the diagram I have represented AS as a 45-degree line and AD as C plus I, aggregate demand curve, which starts from the y-axis. Okay. Now here in the second part of the diagram, I have represented the saving and investment curve. Now, this is investment. Investment is parallel to the x-axis. I told you autonomous investment, when we learned the diagram of autonomous investment, we learned that it is parallel to the x-axis. Investment level remains to be the same at different levels of income. It is autonomous and kept fixed for a particular period of time, and that is why we have the value of that investment to be 40 throughout. Okay. So, we can find this is a saving curve which starts from the negative value, isn't it? The saving curve intersect with this investment curve at point E. This is also a point, equilibrium point. So, at this equilibrium point, saving is equal to investment. So, from that point, if you draw a line to the x-axis, you will get the equilibrium level of income, which is 400 in our example. So, equilibrium level of income is OY, which is 400 in example. Okay, so from the intersection point, if you are drawing a line to the x-axis, you can find the equilibrium level of income as OY. So, equilibrium level of income OY 400 in the example is achieved at a point where S is equal to I. This is the I curve and this is a point of intersection of S curve. This is the equilibrium point. So, both the situations we can find here. This is another equilibrium point OY, the level of income. I told you in the previous approach, ADAS approach, where AD is equal to AS, equilibrium point is there and equilibrium level of income is there. Where S is equal to I, equilibrium point is there and equilibrium level of income is also determined. Both takes place at one particular level, which is 400 in the example. So, I hope it is clear to you. Now, let us move on to a situation where S is greater than I, S is less than I. Now, we have three situations. S is equal to I, S is greater than I, S is less than I. This already we discussed. Now, what happens if S is greater than I? S is greater than I means what? Saving is more than investment in the economy. People are saving, they are spending less. People are saving, they are spending less. If they are spending less, what does it mean? Aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply. So, you can connect what you have learned for adjustment mechanism in ADAS approach. If saving is less than, more than investment, it means that people are trying to save more and more and consumption is taking place less in the economy. That means total expenditure is taking place less in the economy. Aggregate demand is less in the economy, which means AD is less than AS. So, you can write the same explanation what you have learned in ADAS approach. How will you write that? If AD is less than AS, what has to be done? AS is more and more. What has to be done? Try to bring down the aggregate supply. To bring down the aggregate supply, what has to be done? Clear the unwanted increase in the inventory level and reduce the employment level. That means now AD is less and AS is more, isn't it? That means saving is greater than investment. If saving is greater than investment, it means what? AD is less, spending is less and aggregate supply is more now, isn't it? Therefore, bring down this aggregate supply. So, to bring down this aggregate supply, what has to be done? What has to be done? Aggregate supply is more, aggregate demand is less. So, to bring down this aggregate supply, clear the unwanted increase in the inventory level by reducing the employment. Reduce the employment of resources so that you can bring down the aggregate supply. So, by doing that, aggregate supply comes down in such a way that it gets equalized with aggregate demand. So, the same explanation for AD less than AS can be applied here because both are relating to the same concept. Likewise, if S is less than investment, What does it mean? If S is less than investment means what? Saving is less than investment. That means people are not saving more. Instead of that, they are spending more in the economy. They are planning to buy more. That means aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. Here aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. So if aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, what has to be done here? Just to think of that. Here aggregate demand is higher, aggregate supply is less. Why? Because saving is less than investment. As a saving is less than investment means what? People are spending more. They are planning to buy more. Saving is less. They are planning to buy more. Expenditure is more. That is why aggregate demand is higher and aggregate supply is less. So what has to be done? Economy has to meet that aggregate demand. Therefore, increase the employment level. If the increase of employment level of resources are done, what will happen? Definitely aggregate supply will go up. Aggregate supply starts rising and it reaches at a point where aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply. So if saving is less than investment, it means aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply. So if aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply, you have to raise the aggregate supply. That means to increase the employment of resources in such a way that aggregate demand should be equalized with aggregate supply. That is how we solve the problem, and this is the adjustment mechanism. Hope it is clear to you. So the same explanation of AD less than AS less than AD, that can be applied. AD less than AS and AD greater than AS can be applied here for the explanation. Okay. Now we will move on to the next concept, that is concept of full employment, concept of underemployment, concept of overfull employment. So these three are very necessary in order to learn the next topics which are going to come, and we will see what is the full employment approach given by Keynes. Full employment, concept of full employment. What is this? It refers to a situation where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply at full employment level. It refers to a situation where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. AD is equal to AS. Where? At full employment level. Full employment level means what? Remember the first introduction which I gave for you in this chapter. What is full employment level? A situation where all the resources of an economy are optimally utilized is known as full employment level. There is no wastage of resources. Fully employed. That kind of a situation is known as full employment level. So, full employment level means a situation where AD is equal to AS. Full employment, concept of full employment means refers to a situation where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply at full employment level. That is full employment equilibrium. I missed it out. Full employment equilibrium. So full employment equilibrium refers to a situation where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply at full employment level. Okay. So at full employment level where all the resources are fully employed, aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, and that concept is known as full employment equilibrium. Now let us explain that concept with the help of a diagram where x-axis and y-axis are represented. Income is marked on the x-axis, therefore AD is marked on the y-axis. Now AS is drawn as income curve 45-degree line and AD is drawn from the y-axis. Both AD and AS intersect at a point called E. Here both AD will be equal to AS. And from there if you draw a line, you will get the income level, and that OY income level is equilibrium level of income. So here economy is under full employment equilibrium, a point where both AD and AS intersect and equilibrium level of income is OY. This situation is known as full employment equilibrium, a point where AD is equal to AS at full employment level, means where resources are fully utilized. Okay. So this is the concept of full employment equilibrium. So here point E is the full employment equilibrium. This particular point, this point E, this is the point E, that point is the full employment equilibrium level. Now next is the concept of underemployment equilibrium. What is this underemployment equilibrium? A point which comes below the full employment equilibrium should be underemployment equilibrium. Let us see what is that. It refers to a situation where AD is equal to AS. It refers to a situation where AD is equal to AS. Because it is equilibrium, therefore AD has to be equalized with the AS, but less than full employment level. It will not happen at full employment level, but that equilibrium can happen only at less than full employment level. That kind of an equilibrium is known as underemployment equilibrium. So from the word itself it is clear, underemployment equilibrium. What is underemployment? A situation where resources are not fully utilized, some wastages of resources are there. But still, even at that situation, economy will try to reach the equilibrium stage where AD is equal to AS. So, that equilibrium state which can happen below the equilibrium level is known as underemployment equilibrium. That means less than full employment level. So, here already an equilibrium is there where AD is equal to AS. But it cannot happen at full employment level. It can happen only at less than full employment level. I make it clear for you once again. AD-AS equalizing at less than full employment level is known as underemployment equilibrium. Here also AD and AS are equalized, but they are equalized at less than full employment level. That means they are equalized at a point where resources are not fully utilized. Let us see that with the help of a diagram. Here this is y-axis and this is x-axis. I have marked income here on the x-axis, and on the y-axis aggregate demand is marked. Aggregate supply curve is drawn as a 45-degree line which starts from the origin, and AD curve is starting from the y-axis. Both will intersect at a point initially, and we can draw the level of income as OQ. Instead of Y, I have used the letter Q. That doesn't matter, any letter you can use, or I will use the same as Y to avoid the confusion. Okay, let us use it as Y and Y1. Okay, fine. Now, see, this is the level of income, OY. So, this is the full employment level of income, where full employment equilibrium has happened, where AD is equal to AS. Full employment equilibrium, which we have learned initially. Now, we are going to learn underemployment equilibrium. Let us see what is this underemployment equilibrium. Underemployment equilibrium can happen when aggregate demand is falling from the initial stage. Okay, this is the initial aggregate demand curve. I can write it as initial aggregate demand curve. Now, this is a new aggregate demand curve which has shifted downwards. That means when aggregate demand is less, it means what? Full employment of resources are not happening. We are reducing the resources, right? Think about AD less than AS. We don't want that much of resources. Therefore, aggregate demand is falling, isn't it? Aggregate demand is below. That much of resources are not fully employed. That is why less than full employment level. See, less than full employment level is explained. So, underemployment equilibrium can happen when aggregate demand curve is falling or shifting downwards from the initial ones. Initial aggregate demand curve is AD, and the new aggregate demand curve is falling below the initial aggregate demand curve. So, when the aggregate demand curve falls, it is intersecting with the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve is not changing. It is remaining to be constant there itself. So, the new aggregate demand curve is intersecting the existing aggregate supply curve at point E1. From there, if you are drawing a line to the x-axis, you can find the new level of income OY1, which is less than OY. OY1 which is less than OY. That means we are achieving the income but at less than full employment level. Why less than full employment level? Because aggregate demand has come down. When aggregate demand has come down, employment of resources cannot be done. It will be less because AD less than AS. At AD less than AS, more employment of resources are not required in the economy. Therefore, that is what is known as underemployment equilibrium. An equilibrium is happening because the new AD curve is intersecting with the existing AS curve, but it is happening at less than full employment level, and the level of income has come down from OY to OY1. That is why we call it as underemployment equilibrium. Why it is underemployment equilibrium? An equilibrium is happening with the new AD curve which has shifted downwards with the existing curve of AS. As AD curve has shifted downwards, we can say it is less than full employment level. But an equilibrium is happening there because AD and AS curve are intersecting. The new AD and AS curve are intersecting. So that kind of an equilibrium at less than full employment level is known as underemployment equilibrium. So that kind of difference we can find in the level of income also. Income level has come down from OY to OY1. I hope it is clear to you. Now we will move on to the next concept, the concept of overfull employment equilibrium. So if it is overfull employment equilibrium, what has to happen? It should be just opposite to underemployment equilibrium. Economy should work at more than full employment level, right? Now let us see what is that. It refers to a situation where AD is equal to AS beyond the full employment level, that is more than full employment level. So, over full employment, more than full employment level, the resources are employed. There an equilibrium is achieved, that is known as over full employment equilibrium. So, here in the over full employment equilibrium, an equilibrium is happening between AD and AS, and that equilibrium is happening at more than full employment level, over full employment of resources. Now let us see with the help of a diagram where I have marked the y-axis and x-axis. In the x-axis, income, output or employment is marked, and in the y-axis, aggregate demand is represented. Now AS I have drawn from the origin, and initial aggregate demand curve is AD. There AS and AD both are intersecting. This is the point E. This point is full employment equilibrium. So first we have to explain the full employment equilibrium, and after that only we have to explain the diversion either to underemployment or over full employment. So this is a full employment equilibrium. Now aggregate demand curve has shifted to upward, isn't it? See, the new aggregate demand curve is AD1. So AD shifted upwards to AD1. That means aggregate demand has become higher. When aggregate demand has become higher, what has to be done? More and more resources has to be employed in the economy, because aggregate demand or planning to spend or planning to buy is more and more. Therefore, employ more and more resources. Sometimes it has to go beyond the existing level. So let us see what happens when the aggregate demand curve has shifted upwards. You can see the new aggregate demand curve is intersecting the existing aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve is not changing, it is kept fixed. It is intersecting the existing aggregate supply curve at point E1. The new AD curve is intersecting the existing aggregate supply curve at point E1. So this point is known as over full employment equilibrium. That means an equilibrium is happening here between AD and AD1 and AS. And that equilibrium is happening at over full employment. Therefore, it is known as over full employment equilibrium. Now, from that point, if you draw a line to the x-axis, you can see OY1 as the level of income, and initial income was OY. At full employment level, income is OY, but now due to over full employment, income has increased from OY to OY1. OY1 is a new level of income, that is due to over full employment equilibrium. This is the concept of overfull employment equilibrium. So I explain the concept once again. Overfull employment equilibrium can happen when there is overfull employment of resources, and equilibrium is happening between new AD1 and existing aggregate supply curve. So hope the concept of full employment equilibrium, overfull employment equilibrium and underemployment equilibrium is clear to you. Thank you.